I was kicked out at 19 with no money, but I found a way to build a life that proved my mom's rejection was her biggest mistake. And I let her know. I was 19 years old when my mother handed me a trash bag, not a suitcase, not a backpack, a black garbage bag filled with my clothes. She placed it by the front door as if she were taking out the recycling. Then she told me it was time to leave. No warning, no discussion, no plan. Just leave. Looking back, I don't think getting kicked out was the worst part. The worst part was realizing she'd been preparing for that moment my entire life. My older brother, Jason, was the golden child. If he forgot to pay a bill, Mom said he was under pressure. If I forgot one, I was irresponsible. If he quit another job, he was searching for his passion. If I worked overtime, she accused me of caring more about money than family. No matter what happened. The rules somehow changed depending on which one of us they applied to. My father died when I was 14. After that, things became even worse. Mom leaned on Jason emotionally. She depended on him for every decision. She constantly reminded everyone that he was the man of the house. I became invisible. By 19, I was attending community college while working evenings at a warehouse. The pay wasn't great, but I was saving every spare dollar. My dream was to transfer to a 4-year university and study engineering. Mom hated that plan. She insisted college was a waste of time. According to her, I should quit school and work full-time so I could contribute more toward household expenses. The strange part? Jason was 24. He still lived at home. He paid almost nothing. Mom even covered his car insurance. Whenever I pointed out the double standard, she called me selfish. Everything finally exploded over something ridiculously small. I came home after a 12-hour shift and found Jason hosting another poker night. The living room was packed. Beer bottles covered the coffee table. Music blasted through the walls. I had an important exam the next morning, so I politely asked if they could lower the volume. Jason rolled his eyes. Mom immediately took his side. Within minutes, the conversation became another lecture about how difficult I was to live with. I reminded her that I helped pay bills, that I worked nearly every day, that I only needed one quiet night to study. She laughed. Actually laughed. Then she said something I'll never forget. If you're so independent, you don't need this house. Before I could process what was happening, she marched into my room. She started throwing clothes into a garbage bag. Not folding them. Throwing them. My textbooks landed on top, then my shoes, then my jacket. Jason stood in the hallway watching. He didn't stop her. He didn't even look uncomfortable. He just shrugged. 20 minutes later, I was standing on the front porch holding a trash bag and a wallet containing $43. Mom looked me straight in the eye. She said I'd come crawling back within a week. She said the real world would teach me the lesson she couldn't. Then she locked the door. I remember sitting on the curb long after the porch light turned off, not crying, not shouting, just staring at the garbage bag beside me, wondering how a parent could erase 19 years so easily. That night, I slept in my old pickup truck behind the warehouse where I worked. The back seat barely reclined. The windows leaked cold air. I kept telling myself it was temporary. Just a few days until I figured something out. I had no idea those few days would become nearly 6 months, or that the hardest part wasn't sleeping in a truck. It was pretending every morning that everything was completely normal. Because I refused to give my mother the satisfaction of being right. The first month was all about survival. I showered at the gym before work. I kept my clothes folded in plastic storage bins in the back of my truck. At night, I parked in different places so security guards wouldn't notice a pattern. I became an expert at looking like everything was fine. No one at work suspected I was homeless. Every morning, I arrived 10 minutes early. Uniform clean. Hair combed. Smile on my face. The hardest part wasn't the cold nights. It was the loneliness. I couldn't bring myself to tell anyone what had happened. I was embarrassed. Not because I'd done something wrong, because I couldn't believe my own mother had chosen to throw me away. My grades began slipping. Not because I wasn't studying, because it's difficult to memorize engineering formulas when you've spent half the night trying to stay warm. One afternoon, my physics professor asked me to stay after class. He'd noticed I looked exhausted. At first, I blamed work. Then he quietly asked why someone with dark circles under their eyes always carried everything they owned in a single duffel bag. That question broke me. For the first time since leaving home, I told someone the truth. He didn't interrupt. He didn't pity me. When I finished, he reached into his desk drawer and handed me the phone number of a former student. Her name was Melissa. She managed a small apartment complex near campus. One of the maintenance workers had recently moved away. The job came with a tiny studio apartment. The pay wasn't impressive, but the rent was free. I called that afternoon. By the following week, I had somewhere to sleep. The apartment was barely 400 square feet. The paint peeled off the walls. The refrigerator made strange noises all night. To me, it felt like a palace. For the first time in months, I slept in a real bed. I remember waking up the next morning almost confused by the silence. No car doors slamming. No freezing windows. No fear that someone would knock on the glass in the middle of the night. Just peace. I worked constantly. Warehouse shifts during the day. Apartment maintenance in the evenings. College classes in between. Some weeks, I slept 4 hours a night. But every paycheck moved me one step farther away from the front porch where my mother had left me. 2 years later, I graduated near the top of my class. A regional engineering firm offered me an entry-level position. It wasn't glamorous. Mostly drafting plans and checking calculations. I accepted without hesitation. That first job became another, then another. Within 5 years, I was managing projects worth millions of dollars. The kid who'd once counted quarters for gas was suddenly negotiating contracts with national construction companies. Life was finally beginning to feel stable. Then, completely out of nowhere, my mother called. It was the first time she'd contacted me since the night she threw me out. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful, almost casual. She asked how work was going, whether I was eating well, whether I had been dating anyone. For a brief moment, I wondered if she regretted everything. Then she asked the real reason she'd called. Jason had gotten himself into serious financial trouble. He'd started several businesses that all failed. Credit cards were maxed out. His truck had been repossessed. The bank was preparing to foreclose on the house. Mom said families help each other. She reminded me that Jason was still my brother. Then she asked if I could loan him $200,000. Loan. The word almost made me laugh. She wasn't asking the son she'd abandoned. She was calling the successful engineer she'd heard about through relatives. Somehow, after years of silence, she had suddenly remembered my phone number. I looked out the window of my office. Construction crews were finishing a building I had spent 3 years designing. For the first time since I was 19, I realized something. My mother hadn't called because she missed me. She called because she needed something. And deep down, I knew my answer was about to become the biggest surprise of her life. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was tempted, because I wanted to make sure whatever I said, I wouldn't regret later. My mother kept talking. She explained that Jason had made a few bad investments, that the economy had been difficult, that anyone could fall on hard times. It was remarkable how much compassion she had for his mistakes. I couldn't remember her showing me the same kindness when I was 19. I calmly asked one question. Do you remember the last thing you said before you locked the door? The line went quiet. She remembered. So did I. The real world will teach you the lesson I couldn't. For years, those words echoed in my head every time something went wrong. Every freezing night in my truck, every exam I took after barely sleeping, every paycheck that disappeared into tuition and rent. The real world had taught me plenty. Just not the lesson she'd expected. I thanked her. Genuinely. She sounded confused. I explained that if she hadn't forced me out, I might never have learned how capable I really was. I might have stayed in that house forever, trying to earn approval that was never coming. Then I told her something she'd never expected to hear. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger requires energy. Time had turned mine into clarity. She asked again if I could help Jason. I told her I hoped he figured things out. The same way I had. She started crying. She said I was being cruel. She said families don't abandon each other when they're struggling. The irony was almost unbearable. I quietly reminded her who had been standing on a porch with $43 in a garbage bag. It wasn't Jason. It was me. When the call ended, I felt lighter. Not victorious. Just finished. A few months later, my company was featured in a local business magazine after completing one of the largest redevelopment projects in the city. The article included a photo of the leadership team. Mine was in the center. Apparently, my mother saw it, because a week later, she showed up at my office without an appointment. The receptionist called to ask whether I wanted to see her. For a long moment, I stared through the glass wall of my office. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Nervous. I told the receptionist to let her in. She walked around slowly, looking at the framed project photos covering the walls. She noticed awards I'd won. Pictures from ribbon-cutting ceremonies. A plaque naming me Vice President of Engineering. She kept looking around as though she couldn't reconcile this office with the teenager she'd thrown out years earlier. Then she finally admitted why she'd come. She said she'd been wrong. Not just about kicking me out, about who I was. She confessed she'd spent years believing Jason needed protecting because he was fragile. She'd convinced herself I was strong enough to survive anything. Only later did she realize she'd confused strength with someone she could safely neglect. She cried harder than I'd ever seen. She admitted she'd lost one son by trying to save another. I listened. I believed she meant every word, but believing an apology isn't the same as erasing the past. Before leaving, she looked around my office one last time. Then quietly asked whether I was proud of what I'd built. I smiled. I am, she nodded. Then whispered that she'd always thought I'd fail. Hearing those words no longer hurt. They simply confirmed everything I'd already overcome. As she reached the door, I stopped her. She turned around, hopeful for the first time since she'd arrived. I smiled gently. Then said, I wanted you to see all of this, not to make her jealous, not to embarrass her, but because years ago, you told me I'd come back after the real world humbled me. Instead, the real world gave me every opportunity you never believed I deserved. And I wanted you to know, rejecting me wasn't my greatest failure. It was yours. She lowered her head. Without another word, she walked away. And somehow, watching that office door close behind her, felt like closing the final chapter of a story that had started with a garbage bag on a front porch years before. She never asked me for money again. In fact, after that day, months passed without a single phone call. For the first time since I was 19, our relationship wasn't defined by arguments, guilt, or expectations. It was simply quiet. I later learned that my mother sold the house she'd fought so hard to keep, not because she wanted to, because she had no choice. Jason's debts had become impossible to manage. She used most of the proceeds to settle what she could, then moved into a small apartment on the other side of town. Jason eventually moved away in search of another fresh start. From what relatives told me, the pattern never really changed. A new business idea. A new promise. Another failure. For years, my mother had rescued him from every consequence. By the time she finally stopped, he had never learned how to stand on his own. Ironically, the son she believed was too weak to survive alone, was the one she'd thrown out. And the son she believed deserved endless protection, was the one who never learned independence. Life has a strange sense of irony. A year later, my wife and I welcomed our first child. Holding my daughter for the first time changed something inside me. I couldn't stop staring at her tiny hands. Her tiny face. Completely dependent on us. Completely trusting. That night, sitting beside her hospital crib, I made myself one promise. She would never have to earn my love. Not through grades, not through money, not by being stronger than someone else. She would never wonder whether her home would still be there if she disappointed me. Because home should never be something a child has to qualify for. A few months after my daughter was born, I received a handwritten letter. Not a text. Not an email. A real letter. It was from my mother. She wrote that becoming older had forced her to confront memories she'd spent years avoiding. She admitted she'd confused favoritism with love, control with guidance, sacrifice with fairness. She apologized again. Not because she expected forgiveness, but because she finally understood that some apologies are owed even when they change nothing. At the very end of the letter, she wrote one sentence that stayed with me. You built the life I should have helped you build. I folded the letter and placed it in a drawer. I never threw it away, not because it erased the past, because it acknowledged it. People often ask if I forgave my mother. The answer isn't simple. Forgiveness isn't pretending something never happened. It's deciding that someone else's worst decision no longer gets to control your future. I forgave her for my own peace. But I never forgot the lesson she taught me. Years later, I was invited to speak at a scholarship banquet for students who had overcome difficult circumstances. As I stood at the podium, I looked across the room and saw dozens of young faces filled with uncertainty. Some reminded me of the 19-year-old sleeping in the back of his truck. I ended my speech with something I wish someone had told me back then. The people who reject you don't get to decide how your story ends. They only decide where the first chapter closes. The rest is entirely up to you. When I drove home that evening, my daughter ran across the front yard the moment she saw my car. She threw her arms around my legs and asked if I was home for dinner. I smiled and picked her up. Always. Because no child should ever have to wonder whether they're welcome at home. At 19, my mother handed me a garbage bag and told me the real world would teach me a lesson. She was right. The real world did teach me something. It taught me that family isn't defined by the people who give you a place to sleep. It's defined by the people who make sure you never have to question whether you belong. And in the end, the greatest success wasn't the career I built, or the money I earned. It was creating the kind of home I once searched for. Thanks for reading.